Good morning from Toronto, and good afternoon to our guests in Europe. Thank you all for attending today. I'm Jerry Boyer, one of the founders of Harmonized Mobility. We are a Canadian firm focused on the workability of deploying new mobility technologies. Our work includes systems to connect and integrate ride-hailing and public transit. We also offer courses and workshops to help rationalize planning responses to the uncertainty and rapidly changing technologies and demands. And today's critical topic, the real-time coordination of for-hire vehicles for passengers, goods delivery vehicles, and later automated vehicles as they load and unload passengers and goods at our curbs and on our sidewalks. I'm leaving everyone on mute for the first 30 minutes during the presentation. Following the presentation, we will have about 15 minutes for Q&A. If you have a question, please raise your hand, and at the end of the presentation, you will have a chance to ask. The process for raising your hand is just drop down the attendees list. You'll see your name, and there's a hand there that you can raise, and I'll be looking for that at the end of the presentation. So now I want to introduce our co-founder, Bern Grush, to talk about a new project under the support and approval of the International Organization for Standardization, or ISO. This project is designed to standardize real-time operations at the curbside and sidewalk for now and into the future. Bern is a 35-year veteran of the standards making process, most recently working on 2 ISO standards relating to electronic toll collection for road pricing. Bern, over to you.
Thank you, Jerry, and thank all of you for taking time away from your activities and families and for your interest in addressing the current and coming issues surrounding the deployment of our sidewalks and curbs. I hope all of you are safe and able to stay healthy in these current circumstances. I know we all share the alarm and concern that this situation represents. It is now becoming widely recognized that many of the expectations or hopes that we had regarding technologies, transit, planning, and automation are now in flux. What was already uncertain in regards to transit and transportation in all of its modes and formats has now become even more uncertain. The same is true in regards to budgets and funding for many of the programs we had been envisioning until now. One thing that is most likely to remain a focus of concern, regardless of all these changes, is our curb and sidewalk spaces, how we use them, optimize them, enjoy them, and monetize them, how we keep them safe, groomed, and livable. As this current crisis morphs into a recovery and reconfiguration of how we do some, or perhaps many things, the overall intensities of parking, ride-hailing, transit ridership, active transportation, e-commerce deliveries, microtransit, and micromobility will likely differ. Sorry, that slide should have been up a long time ago. I apologize. Anyway, all of these issues will most likely differ from what they were before this pandemic. But what is clear is that the sidewalk and curb will continue to grow in critical importance for space, access, competition, business, and hopefully urban enjoyment. We have largely focused our attention over the past century on the roadway. We have done this for reasons of moving people and freight in motorized vehicles. We have largely focused on the tension between speed and safety, trying to optimize each, usually to the detriment of the other. Relatively speaking, we have neglected the curb until recently. There has long been a struggle over how to park our overabundant vehicles that are idle more often than not. At the turn of the millennium, we have begun to express more focused concerns for proper management of parking, usually around pricing matters. Biking demand started to grow in many cities. Ride-hailing, e-commerce, all things demanding a bit more of the curb, and in the case of scooters and other micromobility devices, beginning now to spill over into the sidewalk. It is projected that we can expect driverless taxis to drop passengers at the curb, that delivery bots will be able to cover the last 100 meters across intersections and along sidewalks, dodging people in wheelchairs, pets, and skateboarders, and garbage cans. One interesting possibility is the notion of a large e-commerce vehicle parking near a number of delivery locations and proceeding to release a handful of sidewalk drones to operate within a modest radius. Some of these automation ideas are certainly still a few years away, but we clearly already have an over-constrained curb with a growing variety and intensity of modes. There is no need to wait for automation for us to begin managing the curb as a collaborative logistics space. We need to incorporate into a single real-time logistics model the dynamics of parking, passenger loading, transit, express delivery, biking, and other modes. That is the purpose of the work we are inviting you to engage in with us. How we are handling the curb today has already started to change. We distinguish three key elements of this activity. On the left, mapping the physical inventory of the curb, sometimes called coding the curb. This is done by a number of service firms today, both in North America and Europe. In the middle, the activity of managing the curb is more of a governance activity. It includes bylaws and usage rights, pricing schedules and fees, enforcement guidelines, court services, etc. Then on the right, there's the actual real-time operation of the curb. This means, given the understanding of what is where and the management rules set by city council or traffic, parking, and transit planners, the question becomes, how are things handled right now at 9:15 this morning? And today, that is guided by signage, prices in some cases, and often enforced by parking or police officers, and sadly, sometimes by the court system. The question posed now is, how will operations be handled in the future as ride-hailing and e-commerce increase and as automation joins the competition for access? There are a lot of new scenarios to consider in the matter of real-time operation. These contemplate automation, but some apply to ride-hailing and goods delivery today. What happens when there are more vehicles than spaces? Should they circle the block, park in the bike lane, stop at the transit stop? It gets more interesting with sidewalk delivery drones. Will there be numeric limits placed per block, including 0 in some cases? As the real-time problem grows and we use more connectivity, we need broader shared standards that interoperate among ride-hailing, logistics, transit, parking, and automated versions of all of these. The sidewalk and curb are increasingly central to cities. There are now so many demands besides simply storing vehicles for a couple of hours that real-time management of these assets in some locations is already in failure mode. The ISO standard we have proposed and are launching has many stakeholders. Many of you on this call are stakeholders. How this will turn out over the next few years will matter to your cities, to your businesses, and to your users. Notice that we put accessibility in a central position here. Our philosophy is that if we get accessibility right from the start, then the standard will work for everyone. This saves doing things over later. So there are two bodies of collaborators: stakeholders, such as some of you might be on the left, and the formal ISO technical committee and working group on the right that ensures the correct structure, expression, research, clarity, and completeness of each ISO standard. As liaison between these two groups, our team brings all stakeholder concerns and ideas into the standardization process. This is a valuable activity to ensure this standard is successful. Prior to being considered for an ISO standard, prior to being considered for an ISO standards project, several things must be provided and accepted. One is a draft purpose and justification statement. The formal draft of this was copied to each of you in our invitation to this webinar. In review, the 5 elements of this pertain to safety, planning, commerce, operations, and liability. If you did not see that document, we can resend it to you if you ask. There will be an email address at the end of this webinar. The standard is somewhat ambitious, so we were asked to set out a specific and limited scope for part 1. Another 3 parts will be described momentarily, but at this time, only part 1 is being approved and being launched. We will propose subsequent parts in sequence, and I will talk about that in a moment. Part 1 is focused on foundational issues, data dictionaries, terminologies, architectures, hierarchies, and metrics for the standard and its documentation. Not mentioned on this slide are the key issues of identifying all the foundational standards and specifications we need to build on. We've already started this aspect of the work. It is critical to base this new standard on as many existing standards and specifications as reasonable. There is every reason to learn from and be consistent with things that are already working and to be internally consistent with the new standard itself. Our first challenge is to harmonize such existing standards. We will choose a number of these as a primary foundation and then merge and build from there. One example, the Alliance for Parking Data Standards, APDS, is an extensive standard to share parking data across platforms. Its data definitions will be important for us. Another is the kerb LR, LR meaning linear reference. This is an open standard for describing kerb regulations, released less than a year ago. This provides a shared language for streets across jurisdictions, companies, and governments. These 2 examples and others need to be harmonized within a normative base. That's a very formal aspect of the standard, that normative base, before we can build definitions for real-time operations in subsequent parts. This work plan was submitted to the appropriate ISO technical committee in October 2019 in Singapore. It shows key milestones to reach publication of part 1 by June of 2022. Unfortunately, it is likely that COVID-19 has added a quarter to this. So assume September 2022. Remember, there is much more to this data definition, to this project than data definitions, standards research, and document structure. We need to detail the structure and communication protocols for operating at the curb and sidewalk. Those are absolutely new. And then we need to integrate these 2 elements. Hence, when each part reaches a critical phase, known as the committee draft ballot, we will commence to the next part. You will see this cascade in a moment. Part 2 applies the data, categories, architecture, and research of part 1 for real-time kerb use. This is the system that handles reservations, priorities, queuing, bumping, queuing in motion, and many other spatial and temporal alignments needed to manage a mixed system of human-operated and software-operated vehicles accessing the kerb collaboratively, safely, and effectively. Part 3 does all the same thing, but for the sidewalk. Part 3 is harder than part 2 for reasons we're happy to discuss later. Part 3 must also be done in a way to be able to integrate with part 2, which is one of the aspects that makes it more complex. Part 4 considers this final integration of sidewalk and kerb. This is because that automation is expected someday to eventually take goods from a warehouse to a kerb and onto the sidewalk and into a building. Consider also the case of an automated paratransit vehicle bringing a person using an automated wheelchair to a kerb and then to a sidewalk. Even the simple case of a sidewalk drone that can navigate from one sidewalk across an intersection, over the curb, and onto the second sidewalk. So not only will the curb and sidewalk become the principal locus of common public attention over the next decades, the curb and sidewalk will become one flow for data, movement, automation, and monetization. I mentioned earlier that several parts of the full project will be staggered to ensure each stage is thoroughly researched and prepared, and that the entire project is completed as swiftly as possible. One thing that causes standards to take a considerable time are its number of readers, commenters, approvals, and ballots. In each case, as the bulk of a part is completed and begins its reviews and ballots, the next part will commence. One of the aspects of this project that we think is critical is to have its user community grasp the overall purpose quickly. We envision a scheme of staged levels of automation to be used as a conceptual device by planners, developers, business associations, and municipalities. It would set rough expectations before specific details are worked out. On the right is merely an illustration. This is not how it will end up. This illustration mimics the SAE levels for vehicle automation. When improved, we think this will be an important communication tool in spite of the problems of the SAE levels unleashed on the autonomous vehicle conversation. There are two key benefits to the sponsorship we are seeking and to collaboration on this project. If you are an operator, a maker, a planner, a municipal manager, etc., a standard that addresses all your needs is important, it's critical. It will give you a head start and an easier time to innovate and expand. If you're a user, whether business, resident, or visitor, then optimized, safer, effective sidewalks and curbs will work better for you. If they work better, then they will create easier and larger markets for the operators, makers, planners, and managers as well. It's a win-win for all stakeholders. Many people in this webinar work for one or another of the stakeholder groups that I showed earlier. Of course, there are more than this, but this is representative. We think it is important that as many stakeholder facets as possible are represented in this work. Remember that we made accessibility central to ensure cities do not spend inordinate effort repairing systems that did not properly consider accessibility at design time. We offer three things to our sponsors: quarterly written reports, which consist of the then current draft, and ancillary commentary, which will also be important to understand that draft, a quarterly live video meeting to review and discuss. This is important for all stakeholders to see the total landscape because this is a collaborative effort. We will caution you clearly not to introduce any commercial IP to these discussions. The standard will be copyrighted to the ISO. It will become globally available for modest fees. You need to know that if you're a sponsor and you're collaborating with this. But most important of all, you can propose additions and changes directly to the project leader, project editor, that's us and our team. Each proposal will be considered, incorporated where possible, and as the formal ISO guideline and processes permit. Basically, you get to author the standard through this process. If you're interested to discuss this further, please email as below, and we'll set a time to talk. Thank you. And now, Jerry, back over to you, and we can answer some questions.
Thanks a lot, Bern. That was great. And right now I'm looking at the list of people on, and so right now would be the time. If you have a question, you can raise your hand. So I can see that Barry Kirk has a question. So Barry, I'm just gonna mute you and give you a chance to ask your question. Barry, you should be okay to go now.
I think so. Can you hear me there, Jerry?
Yes, I can hear you.
Good, wonderful. Technology works. This is all very interesting. You've done a good job with the presentation, but there's one thing which I didn't hear. You know, as we all know, when we talk about curbside, there are very important differences between urban, suburban, and rural. How do those differences in dynamics map into your vision and your roadmap on this?
Wow, that's a good question. So I haven't thought about how that would be segmented or how it would be divided. Right now, most of the thinking that's gone into this is dense, crowded urban curbs where all the competition between all these modes are. One of the things, and I'm aware of your work, one of the things that's important is not just the passengers and goods, but there's also management of these curbs, such as garbage collection and snow removal, which is also expected to be automated. And how will that work in as well? I wanted to inject that because I know that you're working on the snow removal problem as well. So we're more concerned with broadening the operational impact on crowded and dense sidewalk and curb at first, and we're less concerned at first with rural circumstances. By the way, that has nothing to do with automated vehicles. It has to do with managing the curb in sidewalk space. Does that help?
Indeed, yeah, thank you.
Thanks for your question.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Barry. Okay, so I'm gonna put you back on mute. Right now, Bern, we also have some questions that have been typed in, so I'm gonna just kind of go through the list here. Joanne Challam has asked the question, how will the needs of vulnerable road users be integrated into the equation of sidewalk and curb operations for automated vehicles, specifically people with visual impairments?
Perfect question. Thank you for that. That's one of the reasons that we have made accessibility central. One of our staff members, she's probably on the call with us, I'm not sure, but in any case, one of our staff members is a specialist in accessibility issues, and it's actually working with her that had us centralize that element. So I do not have a detailed answer for sure, because that still needs to be developed, but I hope that it's comforting for you to know that we consider that central. As an example, should a sidewalk drone have an auditory element to it? How would that be defined? Is it, would a city be able to enforce that such a device would have an auditory or visual element for the people who are hard of hearing, and so on? These are things we have considered. We just don't know how they would be specified yet, because we're really at day one of this. But thank you for that question. It's very important.
Perfect. There's a few people also asking if this webinar is recorded. The answer is yes, and we will be sharing a link to the recording once we have that available. I've got some, so just want to remind everybody on the call, if you want to ask a question, you can raise your hand, and we can let you ask that question directly. Let's move on to a question from David Chant, typed in, will pricing be a mechanism built into, I guess that's built, so let me restate this question. Will pricing be a mechanism built into the reservation system to help manage demand?
Thank you. I am a pricing person since 2002, so the answer is absolutely yes. However, this is a standard that would show how that would be stated, set, communicated. It is not a standard to say that it must be. In other words, a standard is not setting the governance, but it's setting the all the data and all the communication that's needed for that governance. So it is absolutely included. I promise you that, but it will not be enforced by the standard. That is local bylaws that do that. Good question.
Perfect. Thank you, Bern. So I'm going to go now to Ben Butcher, and I'm just going to unmute you, Ben, and verify that we're able to hear you. Ben, can you speak up?
Hello, yes, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you loud and clear. Ask your question.
Great, hello, Ben Boucher West, Appy Way, out of the UK market. Just a question, it was touched on, but the sort of international applicability, there's the Alliance of Parking Data Standards in the UK that informs the British Parking Association and also the European Parking Association, the EPA. I'm aware of a few threads really across Europe looking at this, and was just interested to know how that latest thinking is brought into this project and the forums for that particular sort of international review.
Ben, thank you for your question. As you're probably aware, the BPA and EPA has a project aligned with the, it's called the IPMI, it's the American Parking Association in a sense. And that's what the APDS, that Association for Parking Data Standards, actually is a standard combining all three of those. I don't know if that's a full answer to your question, but the harmonization of European, British, and American parking standards is happening that way. And of course, I'm speaking to you from Canada, so we would be using those same standards. And that I mentioned in my in my speaking a few slides ago would be one of the elements that we would have it as part of our normative base. Fundamentally, Ben, this work is about harmonization across the planet to the degree possible. It would be good to know that one of the countries that's already supporting this from the ISO perspective is Japan, so that we already have an Asian aspect or an Asian input into this from the ISO side. Thank you for your question, Ben.
Okay. I think I'm going to go again to the typed questions. So here's a question, Bern, from Kat Clark. How will the standard interact where there is not a clear division between sidewalk and road, i.e. shared spaces?
Wow. Thank you. Kat, I believe you're with CNIB. I think that's the context of your question, where those kinds of spaces are particularly complex, I suppose. Is that correct?
I'm sorry, Bern, it was a typed question.
Sorry, I lost track of that. Okay, so I need to think harder about, I haven't thought about how spaces that are hard to distinguish are handled. So I'm going to a little bit cop out. However, that is a very important issue. There's very, very many spaces that are very poorly defined in lots of ways. I suppose that's going to be an area of considerable difficulty. However, thank you, Kat, for that. You certainly raised my awareness of that aspect of the problem. But that's all I can say right now.
And she did reply with a little yes. So the answer to your question was yes, Bern.
Thank you.
Okay, so I've gotten to the bottom of my list of questions. And so I'm just going to take a quick scan through the attendees. If you have a burning question, now's the time to ask. Oh, I do have another, looks like Barry Kirk again. So Barry, I'm just going to unmute you. Okay, Barry,
Okay.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Jerry. A question looking forward. I saw, Bern, your slide about the gold membership, but as you know, we're a small business. A gold membership sounds expensive. How can people who don't have a budget for a gold membership participate? Because this sounds very useful, but we've got a limited budget.
So we're looking at three levels actually. So this gold sponsorship is a commercial sponsorship. We're looking at a slightly lower element for municipalities, because not only are municipalities critical to this, I don't think we want to proceed without them. There's also we're thinking about for NGOs, for those kinds of organizations, especially for accessibility organizations, a very, very lower fee. I don't know if your organization is an NGO and that sort of thing, but I think you might qualify in that area. So we can certainly talk about that. But the gold sponsorship is really for commercial operators who have a very specific monetization aspect in their work. But thank you for that.
Okay, go. Thank you, Bern.
Thank you, Barry. I'm just going to mute you again. And I also have another question, just scrolling through my list here. Mark Dietrich, I'm going to unmute you right now. Okay, Mark, you should be able to ask your question.
Thanks, Jerry, and thanks, Bern. Interesting presentation. Look forward to chatting further about it. I've been doing a lot of work in a number of coordinated areas. You know, smart cities is one example of that. There are lots of other domains. And I guess how I would characterize what you're doing is dealing with questions of semantic interoperability, if to use a big 25-cent word, making sure that there's a standard that describes the domain you're working in, making sure that different players can talk sensibly to one another about what it is and properly coordinate the information that relates to that physical domain. Are you aware, so two questions. First, are you interrelating with, for example, a thing called International Data Spaces in Europe, which does a lot of this work, as well as an organization called Spyware, which has been making some progress in some very similar and related areas, particularly municipal automation, IoT type stuff. And the second question is, have you given any consideration, or are you aware of work to deal with organizational interoperability? In other words, the relationships between organizations that help them work together in a common domain. So you can get semantic interoperability, but that doesn't necessarily mean that anybody wants to play together. So what are your thoughts on those two aspects?
Okay, Mark, thank you for all of that. So there's actually three questions. So your first element, would semantic interoperability be kind of an expression? So yes, part one is that. Parts 2, 3, 4 are really about in the operational domain, but you have to have that interoperability ready and agreed and defined first. To your first major question is that, are we working with the international data spaces and IoT and so we have not. We will become more aware of those things. We would not be specifying what those operations or operators do. However, the data and the communications that we would be defining as a standard would be the kinds of things that those organizations would hold and execute. So we would not be directing them if I understood your question from that perspective.
Correct.
So we're not standardizing their work, but they are in a position to manage the things that we're standardizing for the people that use the standards that we're developing, like that.
Right.
And the second thing, organizational interoperability, this is very much what this is about. How do we share 8 spaces for ride hailing that also have to be co-shared not only with 2 or 3 ride-hailing firms, but have to be co-shared with local taxi firms, and when those are not busy, might also be used in staggered ways for goods loading and so on. So you need absolutely to be able to interoperate among multiple providers, not only just of passengers, but also for goods and so on. So that interoperability, that organizational interoperability is fundamental to our thinking. we're not setting out that interop. We are setting the structures so that the applications that will allow those to interoperate can be written by others. We're not writing it. We're not coding anything. Unlike kerb LR,
Understood.
that actually have a code. We're not coding things. We're purely and entirely a standard.
Okay.
And it's a public standard. It's a public open standard copyrighted to the ISO. So we and none of the people that engage with this will hold IP in that standard. The standard's entirely with the ISO.
Okay, great. Thank you.
And thank you. It's a very important issue.
Thanks, Mark. I'm just going to mute you again. Vern, I'm going to go to a question on the list. We've had a couple of questions added. So this question is from Athanios Mameris, and his question is, what about ISO participants? And he follows that up with members of TC 204. That doesn't mean anything to me. Maybe it means something to you, Bern?
Absolutely. Well, I don't know the exact number, but there are already a couple on this call and on the other call that's coming next week, a couple of ISO participants. In other words, my working group, our working group called Working Group 19 is a working group under TC 204. TC 204 is Technical Committee 204. And that technical committee is, and let me refer back to it this way. Where is that? Back here, okay? So over on the right, that's where that's where Technical Committee 204 is. And so there's a few people on this call that belong to Technical Committee 204, Working Group 19, also Working Group 7, which is a little bit related. So those people are working on the standards themselves. They absolutely can be stakeholders. They could play both roles. But on this call, we're looking for specifically for stakeholders to support us financially and with knowledge of their industry, which of course the TC members also have. But the point about this is to get financial support so our team, and there's about 6 of us involved in this, can carry out this work over a few years. So that's why I describe those two groups as separate in this drawing, but they're both critical on the formal side on the right and on the knowledge and support side on the left. Thank you for that.
Thanks, Bern. Another question from Michelle Perrant. Where do you fit the bike lanes?
So that's right on the edge of this. Bike lanes were used, well, they get driven over by vehicles that are loading passengers and goods. The way these spaces are described, this is like part of what kerb LR might do, for example, or other mapping standards might do. How those spaces for stopping and parking and loading and unloading are adjacent to and leave room for bicycle lanes, for example. That's a problem right now, is that those two systems of loading and bicycle lanes collide. It's very important that we find a way to have them collaborate. In other words, the bicycle lanes in collaboration with these loading spaces. We expect to define how to do that, but we don't have we certainly don't have the answer yet. It's one of the things we'll be working on. So thank you for that question.
Thanks, Bern. I also have another question from Alexander Lofthouse. I'm not very clear on the approach to resolving competition between commercial traffic on sidewalks and curbs, particularly once automated delivery vehicles come into wide use for movement of goods and personal use of sidewalks. So that's like feet, bikes, strollers, wheelchairs. For example, how big will delivery vehicles be allowed to get? How much stopping time and space would they be allowed? Can we explore that a bit?
Okay, that is central. So let me just take as an example, how big will the delivery vehicle be allowed to get? What we will be doing is we will be defining a delivery vehicle. It will have lengths and widths and heights. We will not say what those are, but we will say how it is that a delivery vehicle is described. We will not say how big a loading zone is. We will say how a loading zone is described. Does a loading zone need a height, by the way, for example? Because maybe some loading zones have overhangs and so on. So we're describing these spaces and these vehicles with a common data set such that someone can write an application to answer that question. So I live in a certain city, and my business association would like to have no large vehicles entering our street, and our business association has lobbied the city to not let a goods delivery vehicle larger than a certain size enter. That would be described in the language of our standard, so that the companies that would like to deliver goods to that area would know from the data that might be in one of these data sets that was just described by Mark Dietrich, for example. Those companies would be able to, let's just say it's FedEx, for example. How big of a vehicle can I bring there? Oh, I can only bring a vehicle of a certain size. How many sidewalk drones can I bring with me? Oh, that street only allows 2 sidewalk drones simultaneously. So there's no point to me sending a very big truck with 6 drones in it because I can't deploy on that street, for example. So we're setting the language for all those rules. The city sets the actual numeric values. The city says what sizes and lengths and times are allowed, but those sizes, lengths, and times are expressed in the language of our standard. That's kept on servers that we are not writing the code for. Many of the companies on this call will be writing those systems, for example. Logistics operators will be writing those systems, and on and on. So your question, Alexander, is really the crux of this issue, and that common definition will allow each city or each company or each city to answer your question, and each company to respond to those answers. But thank you.
Thanks, Bern. I've got another question here. I'm curious. Oh, sorry. This is from David Atama. I'm curious how your standard will work to account for commercial vehicles with much longer temporal demands than logistics and freight. I'm thinking of service vehicles that might need the curb for hours at a time. Just let me roll this down a little bit. In brackets, a skilled tradesperson responding to a service call, for example. I am looking to reduce this angle of curbside demand for my master's thesis.
Another very good question. This has always interested me when I've seen very large service vehicles, for example, service vehicles that are cutting the street, for example, and they'll be there for 6 or 8 hours and so on. So how that would be done is there's definitions of spaces, parking and loading spaces. Those definitions, for example, can be described through the CLR, the kerb LR methods, as an example. A company that wants to bring in a large vehicle needs to, of course, prearrange for that, and that large vehicle may take, the entire loading area and 9 of the passenger loading areas as well. Let's just say, as an example, that would have to be prearranged. Those areas would then be blocked out in real time using the language of our standard, but that would be blocked out not in our standard. It's using the language of our standard, but it'd be blocked out in the servers that handle the data for that city. So let's say that there's a company that's written that city management, this curb management software, and there's companies working on those kinds of things now. They would take that request from that company, reserve those spots, and then a ride-hailing vehicle that would like to come there is now going not to be able to be assigned to the spot that vehicle is in. Imagine an automated ride-hailing vehicle some years from now when there's no driver to figure that out, and it has to be predetermined before they go there that there's actually a space for them. And that, in your example, that large vehicle is occupying that space, and that ride-hailing service needs to work around that using a system based on the standards that we're describing. Again, a really good question.
Okay, Bern, it's currently 9:45. I have one more question. We're gonna call it after this question. So If you have other questions, just for those of you still in the call, you can email me or Bern. Bern, make sure that you have your email address slide up on the screen so that people can connect with you directly. And I'm going to ask this one last question from Charis Roberts. I know you discussed accessibility, but specifically for the visually impaired people are already impacted by sidewalks and curb dynamics. How do you expect to accommodate this population?
I don't have the full answer to that. I think the expectation is that we're going to be having as one of our collaborators the Canadian National Institute for the Blind, I hope. There are some things that are done now. I think it's very inadequate, some of the textured sidewalk elements. First of all, those can't be removed. We could easily say where they are. See, again, our standard wouldn't say that they have to be. An accessibility standard says that, but we would have to describe what they are and where they are. That's one example. There's also instances of how curbs are sloped. We would say we can create language for defining those things. I think that's already been done. Again, the standard doesn't say it has to be, but we would say how to describe where those are. I'm more concerned, not more concerned, but also concerned with things like moving automated things on the sidewalk. Imagine a sidewalk delivery drone, and we've already had problems with sidewalk delivery drones blocking wheelchairs, for example. A sidewalk delivery drone could be absolutely a hazard to somebody who's sight challenged. And should that be making a noise, or should that be whatever, or should that device somehow have to always create a wide space between where it's going and any pedestrian at all? That's another thing. How close can these vehicles pass beside passenger pedestrians and so on? So there's a lot to be done in that area, and so I don't have the ready answers because I'm not an accessibility expert. That's why we have an accessibility expert on our team. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Bern, and thank you everyone for being with us today. If you have questions that we haven't answered or you'd like to get involved, you can contact Bern or me to discuss the next steps. And I guess with that, I'll just say thank you again for joining us today, and please stay safe and healthy.